Typically on this channel we cover digital drawing workflows, which has saved me a tons of time, and it's also a very easy way to be creative. But it's far too easy to become dependent on digital drawing tools like iPad to the point of starting to lose some of the drawing capabilities. You see, features like photo underlays for tracing, using layers and undo commands for infinite corrections, and using drawing assist are all useful time savers. But they're also kind of like a cheating. And this is why I thought I'll share with you guys what I call the assembly principle, which is a method for manual drawing from real life that I have learned way back when I was in high school taking my art classes. Think of this approach a bit like going to the gym and having an intense workout. It's challenging at first, but it's necessary to maintain the fitness levels. So what is this assembly approach? Well, it's a method for drawing from real life that is a little bit like a conveyor belt in that it has 3 stations. The first one is the intake, the second one is the absorption, and then lastly we have the output. The very first thing to do is to pick a building or an object, for example, that you would be interested in drawing. You know, the drawing process takes a little bit of time and there's emotional involvement involved in that. So if the subject matter is not interesting, then it will show in our drawing because we're simply not going to put enough effort to it. With that, there's also comes the compositional choice, which is basically deciding which bit of the building is most interesting to draw. 3/4 turn usually works like a charm in most cases, which is basically where you look at the buildings in a slightly sideways way. Then we can also pick and zoom on individual bit of the building, for example, that's a bit more interesting. Okay, so now that we have picked our subject matter and the angle from which we're going to look at it, now it's time to cover what it means to actually look at the object. There is a difference between looking at something and seeing something. And this is because when we look at something, the way our brain is set up from evolution point of view is that it oversimplifies things. So this is why, for example, when we ask somebody to draw a tree, what ends up happening is that all of those drawings look kind of similar in that they have a trunk and some sort of foliage around it. And this is because we all have a certain image in our head as to how the object has to look like. But in reality, if we look at any type of tree, they're all different. None of the trees are the same. They have different trunks, different proportions, and different types of foliage. So this is critical when it comes to perception and looking at the buildings that we're trying to draw. We really have to try diligently to forget the preconceptions that we have about the objects. And then lastly, just to get a bit more practical, what we really have to be conscious about is how we translate what we see in front of us onto the piece of paper. And for that, there's a method of using a pen or a pencil and stretch it out like this so that your arm is kind of full length, and then using the thumb to sort of control the distance that you're seeing. So every time you're looking at the building, you can measure its relative width to the height of different elements, and that way you can determine the proportion of whatever you're looking at, which you can then translate onto the paper. With that as well, a handy thing to do is to check at an angle, again with a straight arm, the relative foreshortening. These are all the lines that basically go to the vanishing point. So the second part of the assembly principle is really in trying to internalize what we just saw in front of us in order to make the drawing process easier and more efficient. The simplest way to go about it is to simplify things that we see. With architecture, it's very straightforward to do that. We basically have to imagine that what we see in front of us are blocks or primitives, like cuboids, pyramids, or spheres. And if we bear that in mind, basically everything that we see in front of us can be reduced to those basic shapes. Now, the second part of that is the resolution. I'm not talking about the type of resolution that you get on your screen on your computer. I'm talking about the fidelity and the level of detail that goes into drawing. And that is basically dictated by the size of paper that we have. The bigger the paper, the more detail we can include into that. And the smaller the paper is, the harder it is to draw details convincingly. So this is the reason why for somebody who is just starting out, a big piece of paper is usually better, because that way we can, 1, show more detail, and 2, we don't have to be worried about screwing up as much. Okay, so now let's put all these things together in our final assembly station and create the output. And this is the step of the process that most people associate when it comes to describing drawing process. Everybody thinks it's about putting stuff on a paper. And so hopefully you're gonna appreciate by this point that it's not as simple as that. The perception plays vital role, and then our brain kind of analysis internally also play part in that. So now that we got to the final bit of of putting things onto the paper, really need to understand the composition of what we're drawing, because the composition makes or breaks the drawings. No matter how well the execution of a drawing or a painting is, if the composition is bad, the whole drawing is going to be screwed, unfortunately. So I usually leave some breathing space around the composition. Typically, I don't worry about, the exact distances between the edges of the drawing. I more pay attention either for the drawing to be central on the page, or if there's any blank spaces around, the area of those spaces are the same. When starting drawing, I find it's really useful to pay attention to the negative spaces. The negative spaces are either the background of the sky or the greenery behind the building, or it can be the wall of the building, for example, and its natural kind of surroundings, the windows, the ledges, anything basically that confines the wall that we can look at so that we can see the contour of that object. This contour sense check is one of the ways we can make sure that what we're drawing is more or less proportionally correct. And then finally, as we go through the drawing, it's time to gradually build up the composition. A great part about this is that this assembly principle comes back in. So as we draw our first blocks, for example, we position them on a sheet. We can then go through the same process again, but on the smaller parts. So for example, with this church in front of me, we start with the blocks, we then go into the details like showing the windows, and then finally all the little nooks and crannies are shown as well using the same assembly approach. So it kind of goes around in a circle. Really it depends on the size of the paper and resolution that we're trying to achieve. And eventually there's a kind of natural stopping point where, depending on the size of the paper and what we were trying to show, we will stop because the drawing conveys the information that we wanted to convey. Now, the benefits of drawings are much more beyond just being able to draw something for real life. So for example, I use drawing skills primarily as a tool to be more creative in my architectural designs. And if you're interested in how you can use the drawing for ideation and concept design, then check out this video right over here, which talks about how to sketch like an architect, which covers tips and tricks on how to improve sketching skills for faster and more creative design workflow. So if you're also interested in digital drawing workflows, then check out this video right over here, which demonstrates how I use Procreate app to create illustrations like this on iPad. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.